Stop the Week with Robert Robinson.
Hello. Our conversation this evening comes from Sarah Harrison, the novelist, Hilary Rubinstein, editor of the Good Hotel Guide, Dr. Michael O'Donnell, physician and writer, and Laurie Taylor, professor of sociology at York University. We had music from Jeremy Nicholas. I've got just a further addition to those immortal lines from bad films. Robin Steers of Heathfield writes to say that when John Wayne played the part of the centurion in one of those Bible films, he only had the one line, looking up at Jesus on the cross, he was to say, "This is truly the Son of God." So he said it, and he said it more or less like that. And the director asked him to do it again. "You haven't got enough awe in it, Duke," said the director. "More awe." So Wayne obliged with, "Awe. This is truly the Son of God." So they stuck to the first take. It's got the sound of an old chestnut, that, but I thought we might have it. Made you laugh, I saw that. Well, my old friend from East Molesey was in a lather of admiration over the Queen's deft way with a pair of chopsticks. He felt the social standing of gastronomic cinephiles such as himself had at last been secured. And he's been strutting about like a piece of rare old Ming all week. "Show me a man who asks for a fork and spoon in a Chinese restaurant," he told me, "and I'll show you a man who orders sweet and sour pork." I bridled self-consciously and blurted, "It's simply not true. I may have a weakness for crispy beef," but he cut in decisively. "Look here," he said, "I go further. I say a man who can't use chopsticks has no business entering a Chinese restaurant." "You mean," I quavered, "man without chopsticks, all say me Philistine?" "I'm not at all sure," he said reflectively, "that he should even be allowed in a Chinese laundry." This was radical stuff, and as a man who, when he uses chopsticks, only picks up his own middle finger, I felt the whole thing ought to be put to a full quorum. It's got to be thrashed out.
I'm not quite... I think that the point of this conversation is that Bob is defending himself from attacks on his inability to use chopsticks, and I think that I want to go with him on this, because although what I recognise,
get a lot of that.
I want to go with you on this because
Going the
I
whole
realise
hog,
the way I am going to support him. He'll be uneasy. He'll be uneasy about it. He'll be uneasy about it.
It's our hog.
Because it seems to me that if you go and start eating with chopsticks, there's nothing worse than seeing people with English table manners but manipulating chopsticks. So there are people who will go and say, "No, I don't want to share at all," but they are holding their chopsticks. They will not, in fact, take little bits, but they will try to use the chopsticks as though they were really a fork. And the savagery of the knife and fork, it is quite absolutely true, I think, to say that really rather eating a Chinese meal with chopsticks properly done is rather like painting a picture. It is picking little pieces here and there. Whereas, of course, the British attack upon food, all that forking and cutting and squaring and slabbing, is a murderous activity compared to the delicate pointillism, in fact, of Chinese eating.
With support like that.
I must say, I enormously admired Tony Crosland when he went to China, and he resolutely called for a knife and fork and refused to eat with chopstick. He was a very independent man. He used to wear a lounge suit when everybody else was wearing white tie and tails, because he had qualities of true independent Britishness. And I think myself, because I'm an absolutely lousy man with the chopsticks, I don't have the courage to do that, but I would very much like to say, "Send for a knife and fork,
You
please."
keep waving two fingers. But I'm driven to say this, since no one's really supporting my charming East Molesey. The East Molesey strict Baptist position isn't entirely a monosodium glutamate-induced fantasy. We see, because he went further, he said there is a rational basis to it. He said if you take little bits on the end of the chopsticks of each dish, it improves the taste, or rather, he says, you then get the taste of each individual dish, whereas if you put it all into a spoon and shove it down, it's a sort of mash that blurs the delicacy of the individual flavours.
What is the critical variable which has to come out? And I don't exactly know which particular philosophical school has concentrated upon this. No. But
the hang-flung.
It is the question of how long it should take to eat a meal, because there are very, very critical differences between people. I knew somebody who, when the meal was brought to the table and I started to eat the meal, would always say, "Why have you started to eat the meal so quickly?" And then I'd have to explain, well, the meal was on the table and it seemed natural to start eating. They said, "Well, take a pause. Take a pause while you're eating." I know other people who, when the meal arrives, don't talk, but go through the thing 5, 6, 7 minutes and then look up delighted and satisfied at the end of it. My experience of eating out in Chinese restaurants is not only it takes 3/4 of an hour to order, because if you are 5 or 6 people around to get the order actually organised, but when the stuff arrives, it is so slow and it goes on for such a long time that the old statement that you always feel hungry after a Chinese meal is because it's taken so damn long to eat it.
But of course the Queen, and I join my East Molesey friend in admiring her dexterity, but of course she has the best advice, and she will have spent half
a
hours
short course lessons
in the afternoons, you know, just
yes.
mastering. But I think the Duke of Edinburgh, on further consideration, is probably a spoon and fork man, and I should
yes,
think...
I think so too.
It sounds a bit like it is spade man.
Fellow. But you see, let's get further into all this business. I mean, all the dishes are numbered in Chinese restaurants, I think you will allow. Now, I've often thought that it must be a sort of solecism not to use the number, because after all, they've gone to the trouble of putting them there. My inclination would be to name the dishes, but it does take an awful long time. But anyway, so I used the number, and I was doing it in the King's Road the other evening, and I started off with that, and the waiter bridled rather like Barbara Cartland catching a man fanning his tea with his bowler hat or something. And he said, kindly name the dishes by their proper names, will you? And he miffed, and he flounced away. And I realised doing it by numbers was the solecism, not the other way
Well,
round.
now, there's a place near East Molesey, not all that far from
Not
East
1,000
Molesey,
miles from East Molesey.
where I was taken by an aficionado of the Chinese cuisine, and he ordered his meal. And he made great play with the sort of, to the waiter, with the hong tai ho, and the, getting the Mandarin tone right, and the rest of it. And the waiter wrote it down inscrutably, and hissing the way they do as he wrote it down, walked to the dumb waiter, stuck his head into the dumb waiter, and said, 2.94s and a 3.
Can I say there's a lower rung down the ladder than that, and that is the one where there are those set meals, do you remember, for 2, for 3, for 4, and you simply say, we'll have that one, and the real embarrassment comes when there's only the 2 of you, but you reckon you could manage the 1 for 5, and you sheepishly offer the menu and point to it. By the way, I've never seen a Chinese waiter flounce. That's interesting.
I can't
No, this one,
Chinese flounce.
he was both miffed and flouncing.
In the King's Road, they all flounce. I tell you, the other thing in the customers. But the other thing, I thought you were nudging up to the old story of the person who walked into a Chinese restaurant, and there around the corner of the door was a plate piled high almost to the ceiling with rice and noodles. And the person who'd just come in turned to the man and said, "Good heavens," he said, "where did you get all that from?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I just came in for 20 number 6.
Hilary, you're about to say something. Oh, put that glass down and have a say a word.
No,
you don't really want to... I'm thinking about the aesthetics, naturally enough. I go to my friend Lawrence, who was supporting me earlier, about the pointillism. There is something very unaesthetic about eating in general, really, because if you start looking around a restaurant and focus in on the mouths opening and the stuff being shoveled in, or the image of a forklift truck, that kind of thing. I remember once I was bought a meal by George Sanders, the late lamented George Sanders, and as we picked up our knives and forks, and he said, it was just by way of friendly invocation, shift-ho. And once you get that sort of image in your mind, looking around a restaurant, it can really spoil the evening, Doctor.
Well, I'm glad you call me Doctor, Bob, because I've been thinking about, you were talking about the hallucinatory effect of monosodium glutamate. I wonder if the hallucinations are over-reported, because there's sometimes a simple explanation. I remember once in Singapore, jet-lagged and fatigued, having to go and have dinner with a group of Chinese orthopedic surgeons. And after dinner, they got up and gathered around the piano, and they all started singing. And they sang "When Irish Eyes Are Smiling." Now, if you see a Chinese surgeon singing, this is obviously Irish eyes are smiling. This is obviously a hallucination. Turned out they'd all been trained in Dublin, so we mustn't leap to these scientific conclusions without proper testing.
That's very... I was rather hoping to turn to sweet and sour pork, but little time left for so large a topic. I think it's popular with the British, because the British like batter. I think it doesn't really matter to the British what's inside the batter. It's the batter that seduces them. But we're going to turn to another topic. Just a brief query on this other matter. Now, call to mind the Member of Parliament who's swapping places with a man on the dole to see what it feels like. Now, I do not question his sincerity at all, but why does it make the flesh faintly creep?
Makes the flesh creep with me because he's doing it for a week. And I've happened to have been in a village that has been where the local pit has closed down and there's no work at all recently because I was writing a book. And to me, this is like saying I'm going to Ethiopia for 3 days to experience famine. The problems are nothing to do with a week in that village. They're to do with years ahead. And I think, if he really wants to learn something, he could go to a health farm, pay the proper going privatised rate for it. He might learn more.
I don't know whether I'm in favour of this particular example, but I do think that it's a very good thing for judges to spend at least a week in jail during the year, and professors to spend a week listening to colleagues, lecturers, and perhaps for gynecologists in particular to spend an hour each week in an antenatal clinic before being asked to strip and then being internally examined by someone who doesn't appear to note their presence. So that I am in favour of this as a way in which you remove yourself from intellectual sympathy and suddenly find that you are reduced to what the American social psychologists used to refer, that you come in contact again with lower order needs. In other words, that you suddenly concerns about food and warmth and space matters that you no longer are faced with every day, so that you can indulge in the intellectual accounts and rationalizations and how distressed you are by inequalities, suddenly have to shift away and you are faced with material contingencies.
But you see, you are the one thing you can't do, whether it's for a week, whether it's for a year or longer, you can't exchange the element of choice. The person you're putting yourself in the shoes of has no choice, and the person who goes along, as it were, to hitch a ride on his life, whether it be the gynecologist doing what you describe or this man going on the dole, he cannot really capture, how can he capture the hopelessness of the man into whose life the dole is only one element, the other thing is the hopelessness that this engenders.
But he can better capture it than by not doing anything at all.
Also, it conjures up some very bizarre pictures. I mean, they're actually swapping homes, are they? One imagines this MP getting home at the end of the week and finding the swappees sitting around the Cherrywood dining table and saying, "We like it here, thank you." Use it too much. It's thoroughly bizarre.
That would redeem the whole thing.
It would.
I think there is another element in it as well. That he's not going to be on his own. His sitting room is going to be full of Daily Mail photographers and everything. And the whole thing, I think, is just confirming that politics is becoming a stunt. It's getting the message across. It's this sort of stunt is taking the place of real things.
See, there is a serious angle to it, because perhaps you might think this is a very good example, but if you take somebody like someone who's been on this programme, Harry Ray, who was a professor of education, decided then he would stop being a professor of education, he would simply go back and be a teacher, and he called it planned demotion. He gave a name to it. He was talking about all sorts of people who grow very sort of old and venerable in their professions and become professors and all sorts of things that should suddenly role change and go back to what they were originally. Now, this is something that I think is a very honourable thing to do. If you consider as well, just to add a little tiny bit to that, the reports back from people, this particular instance may be a stunt, but think of the reports back. Think of all those occasions in which perhaps middle-class, comfortable intellectuals have, for some reason or other, suddenly found themselves in jail. Perhaps they were conscientious objectors or something like that. Their reports back from that jail did a great deal to transform or to direct criticism towards matters that should have been changed there. So that there are instances. This may be a very bad example.
You see, I think you rather subverted your case there by using the giveaway phrase, role change. It's not a role for the people who are unable to change their roles. It's a life. And you think it couldn't possibly happen the other way round. It couldn't happen from underside to topside, could it? It couldn't happen for the man on the dole to say, I think I'd quite like to live the life of Sir Charles Claw for, a couple of years.
Yes, I think the
Not
swap.
a chance.
I think the swap probably is a silly. What I probably should say is that it is very good for those people who are in professions which lead them continually to be passing judgment in some way or another to go and place themselves in the position of those who are being judged.
Quietly and anonymously.
And also, we shouldn't hear about it until afterwards. There's another... You've just reminded me, actually, Laurie, of an example where there is a reward for the person himself. There's a famous story of a London surgeon who was a specialist in a particular operation. He was the international king of it. Got the condition for which this operation was the treatment. Knew that if he went to any of his colleagues, they would be slightly tense while operating on him. So he dressed himself up in old clothes, went along to the casualty department of a London teaching hospital, where he knew the people were well trained in his operation, and only when all was over and the operation had been successfully completed did he reveal who he was. Now that seemed to be a real thing. He learnt a lot. He actually protected himself very effectively too, but we all learnt about it afterwards. We didn't know.
I just want to say, and consider the archetypal exponent of this kind of thing, Eric Blair, the old Etonian. I mean, how very strange that Eric Blair should change his name to George Orwell and pretend to be down and out in London and Paris and Wigan and so forth. But an inauspicious enterprise, wouldn't we say? Because that's what we have been saying. Transformed here by the imagination and the writing of the chap. But I still say this, to try and hitch a ride. He wasn't hitching a ride in an individual's life. He was hitching rides in groups of people's lives. But even to do that, to borrow someone's life, even if it is, and then at the end exercises your imagination, puts such wonderful muscles on the Orwell imagination that you get in the books afterwards, I still don't think it's quite the thing, do you?
Oh, I don't feel any disinclination to criticize Orwell for going down and out, any more than for those who have gone black for a year or two. I mean, those are they produce very fascinating fruits. Would you want to deprive people of the opportunity to get very strange experiences by going down and out?
Well, you see, I was nearly going to say you can black up, but I know what you mean. There was someone who did actually live as a black person. But you see that that black person wasn't usurping anyone else's life. He or she, I forget who it was being black in a general but particular way for her or himself. So he wasn't actually usurping anyway. He wasn't borrowing anything.
It can get completely in general. It can get completely out of hand. I remember in the late 60s and early 70s when sociologists of deviance were so interested in subcultures and deviant lifestyles, they were forever going out and being participant observers in the most esoteric groups, in sort of all sorts of down and outs and vandals and football hooligans and drug addicts. They were always mixing. I can remember someone talking about getting off the train at Waterloo, coming back from giving a lecture somewhere out, I think it was to Goldsmiths or something, and walking past a bench, and there's a bundle of old rags, and as he walked past the bundle of old rags, he heard a voice saying, "Good night, Phil." Another participant observer.
But you said earlier it's a good way of learning things, you know, if you really do this, a role exchange. I don't think so. I don't think you have to. I think it shows a woeful lack of imagination to do that, or to feel that you have to do that. Only one way of getting close to the way other people are, and that is to guess. And guessing is simply what the imagination is all about. I leave you to ponder on that. I see it struck you dumb. What we're going to have now is an excellent song which it really sort of evokes our next topic. Jeremy sings Hôtel du Mouzac.
In the hotels that I stay in, there are certain basic rules, like the mattress on the bed is made of stone. The shower drips incessantly, the milk is always UHT. Room service never answers when I phone. Now, I don't mind all this a bit, but what I cannot stand is something that should forthwith, right now, straight away, be banned. Music, music, why is there always music on an endless tape of muffled, muddy noise? From your humblest B&B and the local hostelry to your Dorchesters and Hiltons and Savoys. Music, music, everywhere there's music, in the function room and in the bunch of grapes. All the tunes you hate to hear, in arrangements dull and drear, it's the drone from which no traveller escapes. Music, music, save us from the music. Why does no one ever bother to complain? Simple silence would be nice, not que sera and Edelweiss. I wish they'd stop the racket and refrain. Music, music, mindless, mushy music, when you're in the lift and while you drink and eat. In the corridors and halls, it seeps out from the walls of the lobby and the Winston Churchill suite. I can put up with the cornflakes that are always, always stale, and the nasty-looking damp patch on the floor, the television never right, and being kept awake at night by what the devil's going on next door. Now, I don't mind all this a bit, but what I cannot stand is music that is background waffle, music that is canned. Music, music, can't they stop the music? It's the same recording everywhere you stay. First synthetic sounding strings, then a kind of doorbell pings the theme from Exodus, and if you go away, music, Why is there always music in the burger bar, the griddle and the gents? They say it helps you to relax, but with me it counteracts, and I end up getting very, very tense. Music, music, saturation music. When the tape runs out, they put it on again. It's a musical malaise, and in both senses of the phrase, I really don't think I can stand the strain. Music, music, the food of love's not music. It's unpleasant and unnecessary too. I have never met a soul who'd not prefer it on the whole if all the music in the world went down the loo.
Hotel du Musec. I do hope I got the gender of the little tiny word in the middle right. But anyway, at least it brings us to the new edition of the Good Hotel Guide. And I think in the guide, as far as I can see, there are no notes on the Debbies. But I was at a country hotel on the Welsh border the other day where the Debbies were very much in evidence. Debbie welcomed me with a sort of enthusiastic severity and said, as though issuing a command, that if there was anything at all I required, I wasn't to hesitate for a moment in letting her know. And she sounded so emphatic, I found myself wondering why she thought there was a chance I might not let her know, the prices being what they were, and over my solitary dinner, I found myself teasing out the source of the faint irritation she'd induced. In suggesting they're giving you what you might think you were entitled to anyway, the Debbies are thereby suggesting they have the power to withhold it. So when Debbie said coffee in the lounge, and I said, oh, don't bother, I'll have it here at the table, Debbie looked worried and said she'd asked Debbie. After which she came back and she told me Debbie had okayed this, and in the way of conversation I then said to Debbie, no telly in the rooms, and Debbie returned this with topspin saying, oh, dear me, no. Our guests come here to get away from it. I turned the telly on in the telly lounge, and Debbie put her delicious snub little nose round the door and said impishly, you won't have it on too loud, will you? There's a lady in the room above, and she's got an early start. And she said she's got an early start as though it were a gum boil or other painful condition. Debbies tend to look at their watches when they take your order. And the one I think of as the original Debbie was in charge of our party in Russia. And when she heard me mumble to my wife, at least they'll give us a vodka before dinner, she replied, oh, Mr. Robinson, I can see you're not going to fit in. I started to tell a bit of this to a chap eating crisps rather noisily in the bar. And he said, are you looking for a punch on the nose? My wife's name is Debbie. Have you come across
Well, I
Debbie?
must say, Bob, if you've come across Debbies who are self-conscious in your presence, after that introduction, the next time you go to a hotel and are recognised, the seizure of self-consciousness on the part of every lady, Debbie or otherwise present, will be something, a new experience to write about. I think I have to say, however, in some kind of overview of the hotel profession, that there are a great number of different sorts of people you come across, but the good hoteliers are like, this will surprise you, monks or nuns. That is to say, they've taken a kind of vow of hospitality, and that hospitality is a sort of, it's like a vocation, and they practice it from 7 a.m., which is sort of Complins or whatever it's called, right till 1 a.m. or Vespers when you retire to bed.
Right.
And when they are absolutely in the role of their monk, it's natural to them, then there's no self-consciousness, and you would have no feeling of embarrassment at anything you said, and they wouldn't embarrass you.
That's a marvellous phrase, Hilary, a vow of hospitality. They hand their actual, authentic, spontaneous behaviour based on this vow to the Debbies, and they can only hand on the blueprint, and thus you get it. But I suppose I'm talking out of a general disenchantment with hotels. The idea of staying under someone else's roof was once utterly charming to me. Now I'd sooner stay at home.
Such a big house now. I mean, but the self-consciousness that Hilary was talking about seems to me to be likely to be induced by the Good Hotel Guide, particularly in places like Italy, where you feel that sort of poor Italian hoteliers being hauled across the coals regularly because they fail to appeal to Tom and Connie Congdon and Dr. and Mrs. Charles Stratton and Jack and Esther Holloway, who are always talking about whether or not the people who run these hotels hotels in Italy, remember. It's a new imperialism, this. They're always complaining they don't speak very good English, they're not charming, and they're a little bit noisy, and on the whole, some of the guests, these are Italian people, are a bit pushy around the place. I mean, the whole of Italy, eventually, and the whole of the subcontinent, well, the whole of the continent will, in fact, eventually have the same manners as Highgate.
But
All
Tom
these people,
and Joanna are actually, and Tim and Tom and Tum, they're all paying. I mean, I'm glad to hear them not satisfied.
That's quite tough on people who have wives. Are they not? I mean, Bob and Jose, or, you know, everyone who's married is going to have a husband or a wife with a name. I don't see why one should make fun of poor old Tom and Connie
I'm not
Condon.
complaining about the marriage of Tom and Connie Condon. I'm complaining about the fact that Giuseppe Verdi is required to behave in the way in which the Condons do at home.
Nicely put.
The Debbies do ask for it. I mean, they've been around for some time. There was a picture-in-picture post of a hotel notice saying, "Please do not wait to be introduced to your fellow guests. We are all one big family." And then the next paragraph read, "Do not leave your valuables in your bedroom."
But the thing is, do we want a hotel to be a home from home, or as unlike home as we possibly can? I mean, this is very crucial, isn't it? We don't want dogs and children to be welcome if we're there on a second honeymoon, do we? We certainly don't. We want them barred completely. And I'm not the only one who suffers from this feeling that the inside of a hotel, particularly those large, grand, ever so slightly down-at-heel city hotels, the inside, it's like the landscape of a dream, isn't it? You have those sort of nightmare corridors with the endless fire doors that close and close. And I always go from a feeling of great excitement and anticipation in the lobby, in the foyer, signing in, to an instant feeling of suffocation and panic as the door finally closes behind me in the hotel bedroom. Then there seems to be nothing which is other people suffer from this.
I just want to also praise Hilary for his coded warnings, real service. I mean, we read of an hotel, it might be the one that Michael spoke of, but if it was, he'd have gone on to quote the other bit. Everyone is on first name terms. Now, the avoidance of such a place is worth the price. We were treated as special friends in Keith and Brenda's house. Now, who, I wonder, is so short of friends, especially when it appears on the bill?
People want different things from hotels, and some do love the first name terms. They like sitting communally around a table, and the purpose of the guide is to steer you to or from just those hotels.
Just so.
But who do you expect to go to? Wing Commander and Mrs. X's well-bred and modernised shooting lodge?
Quite a lot of people.
Or even worse, a hotel handcrafted for lovers of the theatre and the theatrical. Sounds rather dangerous to me.
Yeah, but you need the book, you see, to make you know.
If you've had the book, if you've used the book, and then you have even worse thing. I mean, Sarah was talking about the disappointment in moving from the lobby to the endless fire-doored corridors. But I mean, even worse is when you... Because you study the book, it's the only thing that you know about the hotel. Like when you arrive for your holiday, and phrases stick in the head, like the hotel that I went to recently. The phrase in the book said, "One guest borrowed the hotel boat and rowed across the lake." And I carried this around like a mantra, and I eventually arrived. And on the third day, I said, "Don't you think we ought to get the boat and row across?" And somehow the whole place is set out for you in these words.
Don't you think the very moment you walk into a hotel, you are being subjected to a kind of test by the staff? There are certain ways to behave in a hotel, and the novice is instantly marked out. Or there are types you feel that they're looking for. At a huge, grand, dusty Victorian hotel in Melbourne, Australia, I had a spontaneously flushing loo. And at all hours of the day and night, this loo would flush. There was a preamble of sort of rumbling and grinding in the pipes, and then the handle would actually depress as if by a ghostly hand, and the loo would flush. And I thought, this must be me. I'm tired and emotional.
Afterwards. I'd like to see that.
But just to say, after a bit, I was very tired and jet lagged, and after a bit I thought I must mention this, and I got back on the second night, and the damn thing did it when I was trying to get to sleep. So it said, if there are any, problems, please ring the night manager or whatever it was. So I rang. It was about 1 a.m, and I said, "Look, I'm awfully sorry, but I have got this loo that's flushing of its own accord." And there was this polite but pregnant Aussie pause. Anyway, eventually a young man came up, a very personable young man, dripping with gold frogging and whatnot, and I had to stand there in my nightie, this English woman travelling alone, and say, "I have this spontaneously flushing loo." And I thought, I know what he's making notes about me on. I know how he's got me marked down.
But
I failed the test.
I nearly initiated an adventure almost as glamorous as the one about the spontaneous flushing loo the other night at a splendid hotel deep in the country. I was going to bed, going under the great chandeliers on the landing and over the Aubusson, or what passed to say, and I just got into the arched vestibule of what I took to be my own quarters, had my hand on the door. I passed talking, I should have said, two very senatorial American chaps. And as I got my hand on the door, just slightly opened it, I heard one of them say, "My wife's in there." And I afterwards thought to myself, there's a certain ambiguity in the man's tone. I mean, it wasn't so much that he was scaring off a predator as perhaps offering a friendly warning. I heard myself say as I went into the next room, which was my own, she would have found that her prince had turned into a frog. Mind you, it was late at night and I'd had a couple of glasses of wine, so, but that's places I've come to a real magic encounter.
There is the domestication in here, though. There is the domestication of the barbaric and the wild. And the best line in the whole book that I can find this year is the sheep's testicles at the Oral Otelli in Erzurum are not to be missed. Are they so huge?
Hilary, you must respond to the terminology that Laurie has carefully picked up.
Well, I'm terribly touched, Marbury, that you studied my book with such critical exegesis. But I suppose just to make a sort of confession about this, I am aware that in compiling the Good Hotel Guide, I am engaging in a kind of soft porn. And that is to say that the experience of staying in a hotel is a kind of fantasy experience, or many of the hotels would be fantasy experiences, and my purpose is to write the good ones up while warning you of the kinds of things that you may not like when you get there, which will titillate you. So I think, in a way, that I found a way of writing soft porn which is sort of legitimate.
Can I pay you a tribute, Hilary, having been a bit slightly acerbic about some of the entries? I mean, I'm right behind you in your campaign about tipping, and it's always worried me. And I've always wanted to emulate the great Robert Benchley, who was trying to make a point of not tipping because the service was so bad at an American hotel. And he made it right through the hotel, gave no tip to anybody, got to the taxi, and the doorman opened the taxi door and put his hand out, and Benchley shook it and said, "I'll be writing."
One of the people no one's mentioned, I'm very surprised, I can't, but it must be a pseudonym, Joanne Kinsey Calorie. Signs a couple of the reports, and of course Kinsey and Calorie are what hotels are about, at least in fantasy. But a puff, I must read out the puff you put in for one place. It's their puff, it's not yours, Hilary. We want our guests to feel they are staying in a country home rather than an hotel, and to enjoy being in a beautiful house which has known centuries of gracious living. Now, this sort of tushery saddles the guest with the obligation of living up to his surroundings. But what sort of dim-witted punter is going to feel he's not staying in an hotel when he is? Any such unfortunate is probably already living in a country home, surrounded by men in white coats. That would be my theory.
Sarah Harrison, Laurie Taylor, Dr. Michael O'Donnell and Hilary Rubinstein were stopping the week with Robert Robinson. Jeremy Nicholas provided the musical interlude and the programme was produced by Michael Ember.